I hope that you've been having a great time so far planning out your story, thinking about your character, mapping the world of your story. Right now, we have come to the place in drafting a story that I like best, where now you have the whole plan and you can just go. So as you're thinking about your story, I want you to start thinking about it in terms of scenes. We wrote one beginning scene, and on our storyboard for the hero's journey, we talked about having scenes that have a beginning, middle, and end. And this can be a helpful way to think about a story so that you don't end up starting with one sentence and just having pages and pages of writing and not knowing where one thing stops and the next thing starts. So sometimes you can even think about scenes like a stack of Legos. So you have one scene that you can stack onto the next one and stack onto the next one. And what I like about thinking about my story and my scenes that way is that the parts that aren't interesting, like maybe the part where my character Zoe's gonna have to wait overnight in my story because she needs to steal the berries the next day. And I don't think that night is very interesting. It's probably just finding a place to sleep and waiting through the night. So instead of taking a long bit of the story to write all about what that's like, I'll probably use a tiny paragraph to connect one scene to the other. So if you think about your story in scenes, you can focus on the exciting parts and not get bogged down in the parts that can be kind of boring. So how do you know that you have a scene? Well, we talked about it has a beginning, middle, and end, and you want it to have a couple important things. First, it needs action. Your character needs to physically be moving. Like we had Zoe walking into the community garden and doing some action around gardening, filling up her watering can, getting her tote, all of those different things are action. You also want to have, if you can, dialogue, because that is part of what makes a scene so interesting. And if your character's all by themselves, sometimes you want to even have them speak to themselves out loud so that we get a little bit more of their personality. So we have action, we have dialogue. You also want to have some description. We don't want to be completely unclear about what the community garden looks like or your new neighborhood or the school. It's important to kind of see it in our mind's eye, and also we talked about smelling or hearing, some of those descriptions that will help us really immerse ourselves in the world of that particular scene. So once you have those key elements, the last thing you need is to make sure that your character changes in the scene somehow. So they should have an emotional change. And this is how you know if your scene has something real and important that happens in it. So we talked about in Zoe's first scene where she comes to the community garden, she's so happy, she's having a great day, and then she sees that the sunflowers are not being taken care of the way she wants them to, and then she decides not to tell the community gardener, and she leaves feeling sad. So you can see that there's a change in the scene, which helps me to know something important happened there. That's a good scene. It's got some interesting bit in the middle. It obviously has a little bit of conflict, and that makes the scene great. So hopefully for your second scene in your story, you have an idea now. I talked about mine being my magical doorway moment where my character goes through the watering can and into the new world. So when I think about that moment, I can think about how to make that a really interesting scene with beginning, middle, and end. The last page we provided for you in your planner says big, bigger, biggest at the top. And this is a fun game that I always like to play with writers because sometimes you'll surprise yourself when you push yourself to think about how else might I tell the scene that I'm thinking about in my imagination. So my idea for the second scene is that Zoe sees swirling water in the bottom of the watering can. She leans forward and she tumbles in, almost like Alice tumbling down into the rabbit hole. And so in the beginning, she sees the watering can. So I'll draw that on my page just so I have it. So there's magic. In the middle, she falls. So I'll put some falling lines, maybe her face down at the bottom. She's looking scared. Okay, and then in the end, she lands in the garden. So she's in that magical garden and she's seeing this trickster doing whatever the trickster might be doing. Okay, so that was my original idea. So if I wanted to make that idea a little bit bigger, I can think about the beginning of the scene and how I might add an element. So I'm thinking that maybe she's not alone when she sees the magic in the watering can. Maybe the reason that she doesn't want to tell people about the sunflowers is because the person who's overwatering has been teasing her. And so she doesn't want to get involved with this person or make anything worse. And so maybe when she is holding on to that watering can, she has it there, and that person has just come around on the other side of the sunflowers, and they've just said something to her, and that's when the magic starts. And maybe that's why she leans forward, because where she would have been afraid before, she just really wants to get away from this person, and so she leans forward and finds herself falling into this magical world. So again, the middle is her falling in. So this is a little bit more dramatic. We're meeting another character potentially. That's good. And then in the end, what if instead of just seeing this tricky gardener, the tricky gardener sees her too, right? So if she falls right by his feet, that would be even more dramatic potentially, and could create some interesting additional conflict. Okay, so that's my bigger version, and then I'm going to try a biggest version. So I'm gonna make it bigger so that the magic is bigger. I think we could keep the bully in the garden, because I kind of think that's a good idea. But maybe instead of just seeing magic in the bottom of a watering can, what if that turned into a tornado and it sort of swirled up around her and sucked her in? That would be even bigger, or biggest. It'd be really exciting. She'd still fall in the middle, but she'd be swirling in that waterfall, or in that tornado of water, which would be fun. I could describe it with a lot of sensory detail. And then in the end, what if instead of landing in the garden, she actually lands in a pond and she has to swim to shore, which would be even more scary, I would imagine. So she's gonna land in the pond. Okay, now I have a bigger and biggest idea. And as I went through this, I realized I really did like that character coming in, that idea of the bully who's there in the garden. But I do think that having her land in the pond is maybe a little bit too much, because that's gonna pull away from my story. So I think instead I'm gonna keep the bully, I'm gonna keep the tornado of water, and I'm gonna have her land in the garden, not in the pond. So that's my idea. What I'd like you to do now is you can take your biggest sheet and come up with your 3 possibilities. See if it helps you to make your scene a little bit more surprising, a little bit more interesting, full of conflict, the right kind of conflict. Figure out what your just right scene is, and then you can go ahead and write this scene as well. So now you can use the tools that you have, your map, your hero's journey, your character profile, this idea of big, bigger, and biggest, and you can use those tools to finish drafting the scenes for the rest of your story all the way through to the end. Happy writing to you!